Awesome. So, welcome, Santiago Lyon from the Content Authenticity Initiative. Take it away.
All right. Well, thanks everybody. Good to be here. So before I get into the meat of this, just to introduce myself, my background is in journalism. I spent 35 years working in journalism. I was a photographer in the field for 20 years, working for Reuters and the Associated Press, including a decade spent photographing war and conflict around the world. So I photographed 9 wars on 4 continents. I was captured by Saddam Hussein's army at the end of the first Gulf War. I was wounded in Bosnia. I lost a lot of friends. And then after that, I did a Nieman Fellowship at Harvard for a year, and then the AP asked me if I would like to be their vice president in charge of photography. So I went from being a soldier in the field, if you like, to a general back at headquarters overseeing a crew of probably between staff and freelancers, about 1,000 photographers around the world, putting out about 1 million pictures a year, all of them, meeting AP's standards for authenticity and veracity. So when I had the opportunity to move over to the work that I'm doing now, it seemed to me to be a very logical extension of my life's work in journalism, just from a slightly different angle and with the benefit of, working for a large, well-resourced technology company. So with that, let me share my screen here and pull up this deck that I'm going to use. All right. So the Content Authenticity Initiative was set up or started by Adobe way back in late 2019, which seems like a century ago in technology terms, given everything that's happened in the interim. And it was really the result of Adobe's research scientists looking around the corner and very presciently sort of forecasting the world that we actually find ourselves in. They were looking at neural networks and sort of nascent AI technologies and very quickly realized where all of this stuff was going to be headed. And of course, for a company like Adobe, there were sort of two things to consider: how to embrace these technologies in the service of creativity and efficiency and all the things that have come to pass, but at the same time, some concern about the safety implications of all of this stuff. So we set up this initiative together at that time with the New York Times Company and what was then called Twitter, pre-Elon Musk, really as an open source initiative to benefit society at large, companies, digital citizens, etc. So pretty much everything that you're about to see over the next few minutes is open source. And what strikes me about all of this work is that it's very community focused. You'll see a bunch of normally cutthroat business competitors coming together in the service of content authenticity. So we live in a world where with a few keystrokes, I can create something like this, which, relatively harmless, but just goes to show the power of the technology. And at the same time, people are able to create images like this that were making the rounds a few months back, purporting to show the victims of flooding. And were really being widely distributed by people who just didn't know any better. And I think part of it has to do with the emotional connection that people might feel to the small child or to the puppy or both. But a lot of people not recognizing that actually these are completely artificial. And in fact, if you look closely at the hand of the child on the left-hand slide, you'll see the old six-finger problem, which is, was around at the beginning of generative AI, has since diminished considerably, but is still there as a telltale sign. But how many people are going to look closely enough at an image like that to, ascertain that? And so what they do instead is just share it because, oh, look at the puppy, look at the child, etc. And that's a classic case of misinformation, the sort of unwitting sharing of misleading information, as opposed to disinformation, which is much more sinister and tends to be agenda driven and is much more deliberate. So that's the world we live in. The initiative, having kicked off in late 2019 with just 3 founding members, as I mentioned, has now grown exponentially. I think we're actually closer to 6,000 now. I should probably update this slide. But this is just sort of indicative of some of the more recognizable names of companies and organizations that are involved. So you can see it's got news agencies, it's got consumer-facing news organizations, hardware, software, advertising, social media, etc. And we think it's precisely the weight and sort of size and heft of this community that is going to make this initiative ultimately useful, which of course is what we aspire to have it do. What we're focused in is this notion of provenance. It's a term that some of us are familiar with from the art world, the provenance of a painting, who owned it before, etc. In this particular case, we're referring to the basic facts about the origins of a digital file. Where did it come from? How might it have been altered along its journey from creation through editing and onto publication, and then seeking to share some or all of that information with the viewer to have a level of transparency to help them make a better informed decision about the nature of what it is they're looking at. When we started this work, we wanted to understand the pillars of this area of transparency and authenticity. And so the first area that we looked at was the area of detection. Detection involves uploading suspect files to programs that look for telltale signs of manipulation, things like inconsistent pixel structures or impossible combinations of lighting sources, etc. And while detection can certainly be useful on an ad hoc basis, it has a number of fundamental problems. One, its accuracy. Currently, the most accurate detection softwares claim about 98% accuracy, which sounds great until you consider that 2% could account for thousands, if not millions, of files. Secondly, because of the effort involved to analyze material through detection software, it's not scalable. It just takes a little bit too long to do it at any massive scale. And given the sheer number of digital files floating around out there, that's a problem. And thirdly, it's invariably an arms race with bad actors trying to stay one step ahead of the latest detection software. So while it's definitely a useful technology, detection technologies, we decided to focus in on this area of provenance. But in addition to provenance, we also spent a lot of time on the policy and legislative aspects of this world, because what we're seeing is legislation being introduced around the world that is seeking to mandate some level of transparency around the use of AI and other technologies. And so we spent a lot of time briefing lawmakers and policymakers to make sure they understand all of the nuances here, because of this is quite complex, and we want legislation to be sensibly created. So, for example, the EU's AI Act, which is rolling out in August of this year, we've spent a lot of time briefing the people who put that together, particularly around the code of practice as to how to implement it, etc. The other area we spent a lot of time with is education. And here we're really talking about classroom education for young people, which is a very sadly irregular landscape in the sense that it's taught properly in a couple of countries, but for most countries it's not taught well, if it's taught at all. So there are huge education opportunities there to help young people navigate this confusing landscape. But beyond classroom education, we also think about societal education around the notion of provenance when the moment is right, when there's enough ubiquity of the tools that you're about to see, as well as consumer education when that moment comes. But as I mentioned at the top, what we're really focused on is this notion of provenance. And so provenance really becomes a technology that allows us to prove what things are, whatever they are, as opposed to detecting what they're not. So if it's AI, it's about saying it's AI. If it's partially AI, it's about saying to what degree. If it's quote unquote real, it's about saying that. So really what it is it's a label of authenticity, whatever the authentic nature of the file happens to be. And so the journey is quite interesting. We've been working with creators around attribution and protection from data scraping. We've been working with news media companies around bolstering the trust model that's at the heart of all journalism. We've been working with generative AI companies around transparency in anticipation of these laws that are going to be implemented in the coming months. Corporations are interested in brand reputation and consumer protection. Insurance companies are interested in understanding the nature of materials that might accompany insurance claims. How do they know that that picture of your flooded basement isn't something that you just generated online or downloaded somewhere? Auditing companies, law enforcement. We're seeing reports of defendants being let off because they're able to inject enough doubt as to the integrity of digital evidence in the courtroom that the court doesn't know what to do. And so because, innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, etc., that doubt is precisely what allows people to get off the hook. because the court doesn't really know where the digital evidence came from, and a whole host of other use cases that you see there. And so really what this tells us is that we live in a world where there's a shadow of doubt over everything. Any business or industry that relies on trust as part of its value proposition is probably in the next 2 or 3 years going to adopt provenance tools to mitigate that reality and to sort of say, well, here's something that will help you trust what it is you're getting from us or what it is you're seeing. So that's the landscape. Now we're going to move on to the technology and introduce this notion of content credentials. Content credentials comes out of a standards organization that Adobe and a bunch of others set up that I'll get to in a minute. But really what it is or what they are is a digital nutrition label for online content. So in the same way you go into a supermarket and pick up a can of beans and can quickly inspect the label to see, how much sugar, calories, salt, etc. Here you can do the same thing with a piece of digital content and understand where it comes from. And so we've been working on this as it relates to a variety of formats with more to come. But in order to really make this work, we have to sort of look at every area of the digital supply chain. And so when we get into content credentials that, as I mentioned, come from the standards organization, the C2PA, or the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity, which is a nonprofit standards org within the Linux Foundation that I'll describe in more detail in a minute, we've had to divide the labor up into a number of areas, starting with capture. So here we're working with the hardware manufacturers, cameras, smartphones, to integrate C2PA technology at production, meaning that when you buy a piece of hardware, it comes out of the box with C2PA on it. You can choose to activate or deactivate it depending on what the default settings are. And that allows you to say, right, this file came from this particular device. Perhaps if you're interested, GPS coordinates, time, date, technical settings, whatever might interest you. And that's the sort of the genesis of the file. And to that end, a lot of major manufacturers are busy implementing. So Canon, Sony, Nikon on the camera side of things, Google, Samsung on the smartphone side of things. And we're, working or trying to work with the folks at Apple towards that end as well. So good progress there. But then we move on to the next area, which is editing. And so this technology is implemented already in a bunch of editing technologies. Adobe, obviously, so it's in, Photoshop, Lightroom, InDesign, Premiere, etc. But also a bunch of non-Adobe softwares as well, given the open source nature. And that allows you to track what was done to the file. Was it cropped, toned, darkened, lightened, edited, whatever might have happened to the file, which is very useful for that sort of chain of custody, if you like. And the third area is the area of publishing. So here we're working with the content management system landscape, as well as the content distribution network providers, the Fastly's, Akamai's, Cloudflare's, etc. And the goal here is to maintain the integrity of the content credential so that ultimately it can be displayed to the user and offer some insight into where did this file come from, etc. So we can get very granular at each step of the way, as you can see here. But of course, we recognize that not everybody wants to capture or share all of this information. There are sometimes security concerns, privacy concerns. So ultimately, all of this is customizable, and the user will be able to determine how much or how little information they want to share. So this is the logo that we are socializing, trying to make as ubiquitous and as widely understood as, let's say, the copyright symbol or the Creative Commons symbol, so that when people see this little CR icon, they know that it indicates that the file has additional information available for inspection. But in the same way, when you walk into a supermarket, you probably don't look at every single nutrition label on every foodstuff. You might look if you have a health concern or something like that. So in this case, content credentials would be for those images that you're skeptical about or curious about, etc. In terms of the technology behind this, we are advocating that, the standard contemplates a whole bunch of things, the technical standard from the C2PA, including blockchain. But what we're focused in on are the following components of resilience. So we start with cryptographically secure metadata or tamper-evident metadata. This is what's called public key infrastructure technology, not dissimilar to what you might use for online banking. involves, ACID hashes, linking information about the file to the file. But of course, because it's metadata, it's vulnerable. It gets stripped off with some ease. And so to make it more resilient, we add fingerprinting, which is to say we store some information about the file on the cloud, allowing us to compare the file at hand with what was previously stored on the cloud. And then to make it even more resilient, we can add invisible watermarking, which, is imperceptible and survive screenshots and those kinds of things. So when we combine all of these things, the metadata, the fingerprinting, and the watermarking, we have something that is really quite resilient and what we call durable. And that's the implementation that Adobe and others in this Content Authenticity Initiative are advocating for. In other words, don't just use metadata because it'll get stripped off, but use metadata together with fingerprinting and watermarking to make something actually resilient. Also, some products are offering protection from data scraping. So as we know, data scrapers are sort of, quite cavalierly scraping the whole internet to train their models, usually without the knowledge or permission of the copyright owners. And so this allows creators to add a creator opt-out or a do not train label. Of course, it's dependent on data scrapers respecting it, but what we're starting to see in the legal space is after years of plaintiffs getting no relief, a recent case involving Anthropic provided some relief for authors whose material was used to train Anthropic's LLM. So it may be that the legal pendulum is swinging more in favor of the creators, in which case this will ultimately prove to be quite prescient and useful. When it comes to AI, if I were to come across this image of penguins in the desert, and if everything were set up correctly, I would click on the little CR icon, and that would expose, in this case, the content credential that tells me that this file came out of Photoshop and Firefly, which is Adobe's generative AI suite of products. So it's the sort of interactivity, and then with the security stuff in the background, allowing you to know that this is real, making it very difficult to spoof. On video, we've created a video player. So if this were a video, as you can see here, the line is blue, everything is good, until all of a sudden the line is red and the little content credential gets an X. What happened? Was the audio altered? Was some other change made to the file? So it's sort of like a dynamic content credential that allows you to inspect a certain part of the video. The player supports a couple of important formats, and we're working on getting MXF, which is a particular video wrapper that allows videos to be migrated from one editing technology to another. That's all underway as well to make this even more useful. Archival use cases, of course, this needs to be backwards looking as well as forwards looking. And so we've been chatting with the Library of Congress in the United States as well as the National Archive in the UK and looking about, is it possible to retrofit credentials or add them while digitizing or display them on our interfaces or attach them at the moment of download? All of those conversations are underway. And the beauty of everybody working from a common standard, of course, is that it makes it all interoperable ultimately, which is something that we aspire to in the service of ubiquity. But all of this comes out of the C2PA organization that I mentioned before, the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity. Those companies that you see there on the right are on the steering committee of the C2PA. The C2PA is a nonprofit standards organization that was formed by Adobe together with Microsoft, Intel, the BBC, and TruePic. And then those other steering committee members came on later. As a standards organization, it lives within the Linux Foundation as what's called a Joint Development Foundation project, which means that it's unencumbered by IP. Nobody owns the output of the C2PA, which means that users are not beholden to one particular vendor or another, which is attractive. There are more than 300 tech companies involved in crafting the standard. It's divided up into a number of task forces, photo, video, threats and harms, text, design, user interface, etc. Adobe chairs the technical working group, and the standard, it's on its way to becoming an ISO standard eventually, which will give it that sort of imprimatur of gravitas that will make it easier for other standards bodies to incorporate and adopt. So the way that we think about this stuff then is that the C2PA is, if you like, the architect's blueprint upon which everything is based. And the Content Authenticity Initiative then is the movement aimed at accelerating implementation of the C2PA standard globally. And so how do we do that? We do three different things. We spend, and by we, I mean Adobe spends a lot of time and effort building open source tools to facilitate C2PA implementation. Those tools sit on GitHub. We run a very vibrant Discord channel with instructional materials and questions answered in as close to real time as possible to really make it easier for developers to implement the standard. The second thing that we and others in the initiative do is productize this. So, this is in a bunch of Adobe products already, as well as in Microsoft products, Google products, OpenAI products, etc. LinkedIn is another one. So we're starting to see it really become adopted around the world, which is great. And then the third thing we do, and that's the area that I oversee, is sort of talk about the initiative, explain it, grow membership, provide value to members through events, in-person events, online events, blogs, newsletters, just the steady drumbeat of telling the story of how the initiative is going. Because, we've been at this for 5 years now. We're starting our sixth year. And while we've made a lot of progress, to be sure, in those 5 years, there is a lot of road ahead of us. And so we want to keep awareness and accurate information about this out there as much as possible. Um, so when we talk about C2PA in the wild, then, these are just some of the companies who are busy implementing C2PA. It's not a complete one-to-one match with the CAI community because some implementers are not formally part of the CAI community, but that's okay. They're out there implementing C2PA, and that's ultimately what we want to see. Because when we try and define success, we talk about ubiquity, a world where everything will have content credentials on it, and the absence of content credentials will be the flag. In the same way as if you were to walk into a supermarket and there were three cans of beans and two had nutrition labels and one didn't, might you think twice before eating the one that didn't have a nutrition label? Perhaps. So, like I said, these are just some of the companies out there. As you can see, it's a real who's who of, tech, hardware, software, news media, advertising, etc. And it's real progress. It's looking good. In the enterprise space, this is where we're seeing a lot of interest at the corporate level. And the use cases are interesting. They're not just about the provenance. One, for example, is about attribution. So if I'm a bank and I send out a video to my customers, how do they know that's really from me? So using a content credential to say this is from bank, of whoever. The other use case here is wayfinding. So this is using the content credential as a label to track assets across a supply chain. So let's say I'm a company and I've licensed a picture of a famous athlete in the service of my company, but that license is time constrained. And after 6 months, I need to take that image down. Well, it turns out if I'm a multinational, in 6 months, that image is probably, spread across multiple dams and mams around the world, and I can't find it. And as a result, I'm exposed as a company to risk. By using C2PA, I'm able to identify all instances of that asset and make sure that I comply with whatever the licensing terms were. And then bill of materials, which is the sort of standard, how was this made, etc., which is what I've just been describing. I'm going to show you a little quick 1-minute video here of content credentials sort of in action in Photoshop, which is quite illustrative. So I'm in Photoshop, I enable content credentials. I do a little preview. This image already has a credential because it came from Adobe stock and all that stuff now comes with credentials. So what I'm going to do here is manipulate the image significantly, starting with the tonality, add some AI clouds to the background, take another image, lay it on top here, clear it up, and then all of a sudden I have an image that purports to show the pyramids in a blizzard. Okay, great. Now what I'm going to do is attach the content credential to the image. Now imagine it pops up in a social media website, snowy pyramids. I hit CR that tells me it came out of Photoshop, but then when I hit inspect, I'm able to see the component parts of the image. And then with this little slider, I'm able to see, okay, what did I start with and what did I end up with? So that's a very clear sort of graphic representation of how this could work and how it probably will work ultimately as we continue to work with the other players in the ecosystem. And then in terms of, what else is out there, so Google Pixel and Samsung Galaxy S25 and just the other day S26 are now incorporating content credentials. Camera manufacturers, Sony just rolled out a new camcorder that supports C2PA. OpenAI applies credentials to downloaded output from DALL-E 3 and Sora. SmartFrame, which is a sports licensing company in the UK. BBC has been at the forefront of implementing this stuff. LinkedIn, you're starting to see it more and more on LinkedIn. National security, so the image distribution arm of the Pentagon has been using it for a while, as well as major intelligence agencies. So a lot of use out there. And then I'll just finish by underscoring sort of what I started with, which is these three key pillars, because I think it's really important to understand that the technology is only going to get us so far. And so the provenance technologies that involve these things, that's good and that's solid, and the tools are there and they are being implemented, but they can't succeed in isolation. And so the other area that I mentioned was education. Whether it's classroom or societal or consumer, as we get more implementation, we're going to need more education and awareness so that people are paying attention and are aware. And then lastly, the policy aspects of this, which will likely be the lever that pushes companies into implementing provenance technologies. Because in essence, these are safety tools, right? Trying to make the internet a safer place by providing more information to help users make better informed decisions about how to react to content. It's not big tech telling you what's real and what's not, far from it. It's technologies used to add a layer of transparency and authenticity so that you can look at that picture of, let's say, the Pope in the puffy white coat of a few months ago and say, well, actually, that came from AI, right? Which wasn't at all clear at the moment. And so that's really the initiative in a nutshell. If there's a call to action here, it would be join us. It's free to join. Go to this, use this QR code or go to contentauthenticity.org. We welcome anybody and everybody, individuals, companies, organizations. And that gets you into the community, gets you made aware of things in the space, invitations to events, newsletters, blogs, etc. Because as I mentioned earlier, this is really a community effort and is helped a lot by that community spirit. So that's what I wanted to sort of spend a little bit of time explaining, and now we're happy to open it up to questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Santiago, for that presentation. Super cool. And I really appreciated you bringing it back to that last slide around technology alone is not the end all be all solution. As a person on the side that does that education piece and now more so in the last year than ever, more thinking policy piece. Like I really appreciate that yeah, that multi-prong approach. And I think a lot of the projects in the Metagov orbit generally could benefit from taking that more holistic approach, pairing technology development with these other yeah, spheres of influence, I guess. So thank you for that. Yeah, let's get into questions in the chat. If folks have any other questions, feel free to add them in. But let's see. It looks like Steve, what you were the first one to ask a question. It looks like you have some technical stuff. Feel free to unmute, or if you want me to just read it, I can. I know you like to speak though.
Yeah, I'm just wondering. I mean, it's probably a little bit, I don't know where you are in this process, so I'll just ask. So, what about SDKs? How are going, end developers going to implement this on their sites?
Yeah, so the SDKs and all of the, JavaScript stuff and all of the tools that you need to implement, all those sit on GitHub. And so people can go there and access the tools to actually implement. And when they run into problems, we've recently contracted with some external experts who've been involved with this for a number of years to really be there to answer questions in quasi real time. We've also created a bunch of instructional educational material because there's some complexity here, obviously, and so developers are constantly, running into questions. Also, because the spec has been constantly evolving over the last few years, not everything is backwards compatible, and so people are running into those things. But we're getting to the point now, I think we're on version 2.3 of the standard, where things are starting to stabilize. In addition, the C2PA is running a conformance program so that implementers can make sure that their implementation is conformant, and then they get a little sort of stamp of approval, if you like. And we're creating databases to allow C2PA members to see who is conformant. On the CAI side of things, we're creating a marketplace to connect builders with implementers so that people can learn from each other's progress, etc. So it's a very dynamic environment. I would say developers probably best served going to GitHub. You can access that GitHub channel directly through the CAI website, and just, you'll see when you get on there, there's a lot of activity.
Cool. And then I saw, Steve, you had a question. The first question you asked, do you record a hash of the code that created the signature as part of the signature, or rather the executable?
Yeah, I'm afraid to be completely honest with you, Steve, my technical background doesn't go that far,
Yeah,
but
all
I can
I'm saying,
certainly
I
get an
mean, you
answer.
have this cryptographic,
Yeah.
see more and more elements of the use case I'm trying to allude to here, which is that you have, the cryptographically secure metadata that gets me part of the way there, and then your whole where you show the inputs into the process. So I'm just wondering the degree to which the transformations are recorded granularly, both to make sure that the tool that transformed them really is the tool that's transforming them, and then what particular transformations occurred. So I'm just saying how much of that is recorded.
Yeah, I think it can be very granular, and you can get a great deal of detail at every step of the way because, it's additive in the sense that as you do things to files, you just add to the manifest and sort of re-secure it. So it's different from blockchain in the sense that it's immutable once you have an asset out there. If you need to correct it, you need to sort of replace it with another asset. That's not the case here. It's all additive. And as I understand it, the level of detail can be very, very granular. So you would get that, yeah, this was actually done in Photoshop and then it was moved to a Gen AI program and then something else happened to it to allow you to see the complete provenance.
Awesome. And then Kalia asked a question about working with Witness. Yeah, I
Yeah,
also know
Witness
them.
have been very active. They are interested in using this to sort of validate the provenance of their, videos as they relate to human rights, and all of that kind of stuff. And they're also rightly concerned on the sort of threats and harms aspect of this with regards to privacy, because you can imagine in the field of human rights. The last thing a human rights defender is probably going to want to have is their identity inextricably associated with a piece of damning content, showing a human rights abuse, because that could cause them significant, problems down the road. So Witness, Sam Gregory and Jacobo Castellanos and those folks have been really very active and importantly so in the community, advocating for the human rights use cases here as distinct from some of the other use cases.
Nice. Yeah, I also saw Proof Mode on your list of partners, and I met them at DWeb Camp a couple years ago.
Yeah, they've been super busy.
That's great news. All right, and Rosa says, I wonder about using ZK proofs being used to confirm authenticity without revealing sensitive metadata.
I'm not sure what ZK proofs are. Probably something for me to educate myself with or about. But the privacy concerns are very front in mind, right? And that varies by industry, that varies by geography. So, for example, when I'm talking to people in Germany, they're hyper aware of the privacy issues. So, as I indicated, there is a quite sophisticated level of customization possible here in terms of what people want to share. And in fact, privacy was probably at the root of something that happened early on in this work, which is where, starting with version 2.0 of the C2PA standard, identity was excised from the standard. So essentially in provenance, you have how something was created, the technical details around the tool, etc. And then you have who created it, an individual or an organization. And so identity was excised because there were significant concerns around privacy. So identity now lives in an adjacent organization called the Creator Assertions Working Group, or CAWG, and they're interested in digital identity and work very closely with the C2PA to incorporate identity as appropriate for those industry sectors that are interested in it. For example, creators are often interested in identity for attribution purposes, or news media companies are interested in identity to be able to say this actually was published by the Financial Times or the AP or whoever. So yeah, a lot of work being done on the identity space, while at the same time protecting people's identity where that's appropriate.
Yeah, curious, Kalia, if you have any thoughts or questions regarding the identity work being done. Not to put you on the spot, but just in case, I saw you also had a question in the chat.
Yeah, no, I'm tracking the identity stuff. I was more curious, like, I feel that witnesses' engagement with the C2PA feels very productive and generative, which is in contrast to a lot of what I see civil society groups do in relationship to technical standards, which is show up late to the game and scream no, which is different than show up early and have your concerns heard and taken seriously by the um, the cluster of corporations who are actively building a thing and care and want to take those concerns seriously. And you guys chose to, instead of ignoring witness, like actually proactively pull them in and help shape the protocols with them. And that to me is like what's interest, like why I asked you to share, is because it's really different than what I, as a person who's bridging both worlds constantly and have done so for 20 years, find a lot of the civil society groups' choice of tactics lacking in terms of understanding what's going on and the willingness of um, technical communities to take their concerns seriously if they show up often, early, and engage in the process.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, I think there is, as I mentioned earlier, there's a really vibrant community aspect to this work. And because people are coming to understand at different paces and at different times, are coming to understand that, we used to live in a world where pictures or it didn't happen, right? And now we're in a world where pictures and maybe it didn't happen anyway, right? And video was always the acid test historically because video was so difficult to fake, right? Manipulating still images has been going on for, 150 years, but video was the acid test, and now that's been obviously addressed through generative AI, text to video. And so I think what people are slowly starting to wake up to is, hey, we no longer have any idea about the authenticity or the veracity of anything that we're looking at. And, witness the ongoing conflict in the Middle East right now. You're getting flooded with images purporting to show explosions here, there, everywhere, and many of them are completely fake. Or what I've seen in my social media feeds, particularly, is the area of nature videos, right? Where, once upon a time, you would see species interacting in a way that would make sense according to the location. And now you have hyper-realistic nature videos showing creatures that would never come near each other, appearing to come near each other. And of course, that has, knock-on effects for all sorts of sectors, educational and creative, etc. So what I'm seeing writ large is different sectors are moving at different paces, in part because they have different concerns. Identity in journalism was a big concern. The sort of linkage of the CAW work back to C2PA to be able to assert organizational identity. Those technical hurdles have, for the most part, been resolved. I think we're going to see some announcements in the coming months. That then clears the way for news media companies to really, embrace this. And there, as in with other sectors, what I see, not surprisingly, are many more followers than there are leaders. But the leaders have a real opportunity either to differentiate their companies or their products or themselves and take on these leadership roles and lead the charge. And then if they're influential or successful enough, others will follow. The other thing, of course, that, as I mentioned, we've been at this now for 5 years and we're starting our sixth year, is that, because there's so much complexity, because there are issues around awareness, because this is something that, probably touches most aspects of society and business, it takes time. And it's also a heavy lift. It's not just a technology tool, as I mentioned. It really is, in some ways, a tool that facilitates behavioral change as it relates to skepticism around information. And certainly my generation growing up in the Cold War, there was a lot more put on understanding the provenance of things to understand the agenda behind them. Who's publishing this? Where's the money coming from? What is the agenda here? I think that over the last, I don't know, 10 or 20 years, those habits have sort of become somewhat dormant. And I think, has to do with resuscitating healthy skepticism and providing the tools by which people can validate or not their skepticism, which is why this interdependency is so important between the provenance, the education in all its forms, and the policy aspects in all its forms. So I feel like we're moving in the right direction, but it's probably going to take a little while longer before we get that level of ubiquity where, in the same way, not to, hark too much on the nutrition label analogy, but you go into any supermarket pretty much anywhere in the world, and every product, packaged food stuff, has a nutrition label on it. How do we get there with provenance around digital content? I think it's through these technologies combined with the education and legislative aspects.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I had a question, Santiago, about some of these big business partners and if and where you've seen some of this work like come up against their business incentives. Um, I mean, I can't imagine they're in the business of fake news explicitly. But I wonder about the content authenticity piece, but then also maybe hearing about some of the other like data, like model training data stuff you mentioned. I could imagine.
We've been working a lot with OpenAI, and they've been involved from the outset in terms of putting content credentials onto downloads of stuff that gets generated, in their cases, in Sora for video and DALL-E for still images. And it's good. I mean, it's, you create something in either of those programs and download it, and it gets a content credential. I think the opportunity is to make that content credential more robust, because currently it's limited to the metadata. And as we know, the metadata is fragile. And if I don't zip the file or take care with it, chances are the metadata is going to get stripped off at the first corner. And so, working with them and others to encourage more robustness in the content credential, to add the fingerprinting or to add the invisible watermarking where appropriate. But then, of course, it also is going to require the support and the adoption by the social media platforms. And there is work being done in that area. We're working with Meta, we're working with TikTok, and all of those folks. But I think there's more opportunity to do more. And I don't know if you saw the other day, Meta's oversight board recommended that Meta embrace provenance technologies like C2PA in a more standardized way across their enterprises, in order to, enhance the security and safety of their users. The oversight board has sway to a certain degree, but ultimately that's going to be a company decision. So I think the legislative aspects of this are likely to nudge people in the right direction. But it's a process, and as you indicate, there are lots of different business models out there that are dependent on things that have to do with viewer engagement and time spent on websites. And we all know that it's easy to go down rabbit holes and and spend your afternoons doom scrolling, as opposed to having a real sense of what might be happening in the world.
So interesting. Any other thoughts, questions? Steve, I
Yeah,
see.
I want to jump back in just one thing, and I'm going to read. It said, I'd like to see this extended to being able to include provenance from expert opinion on the photo or such, where technical provenance provides insufficient for verifiability. Like, for example, real historical photo or not.
Right. The archival aspect of it is interesting. And in our conversations with the Library of Congress and the National Archive and the Archive in the UK, we're starting to see some more engagement there. Those archival industries, from what I can tell, are quite process driven and quite regimented in their structure. And so, if you're going to introduce a new sort of workflow, as it were, to add provenance technologies to archival collections. It can happen, and I indicated in the presentation in multiple different ways. Probably the easiest way is at the DAM level, digital asset management system level. So when I download something from a particular archive, I get a content credential on it that says it's from that archive. Now, of course, that could beg the question as to whether that archive's content is sort of verifiable in and of itself and what processes were made to do that. But that's similar to the news industry world, which is, where my background is. So, the Associated Press, where I worked for a quarter of a century, they're not going to put anything out there with their name on it until it's been reviewed by, in some cases, multiple sets of eyeballs and meets their editorial standards. That work is largely invisible. Some people know and appreciate that if something goes out with the AP's name on it, it's gone through that process, but other people aren't aware of that. So using a content credential to be able to link that back to a set of standards and principles so that if somebody is really curious, they can say, okay, this not only has the AP's name on it, but this is how they came to the decision to, publish it. So I can see down the road potentially more customizable fields for people to add additional information. But at the moment, in the interests of getting something across industry and scalable, the information is to a large degree technical in nature for the how aspect of it, and then focused in on the identity of the publisher, whether it's an organization or an individual. Down the road, there's a potential that that would broaden, but we've got a lot on our plate with what we have at the moment.
All right.
Cool. And if you have
Oh yeah,
time for
great.
one more question.
I just one last comment on this. Yeah, I mean, people aren't going to care about this type of stuff, but hopefully we'll have personal AI agents that will, and so all that level of granularity will not be lost in the future, hopefully.
Yeah, the AI stuff is fascinating. I saw Meta bought a company the other day, name escapes me right now, that I had no idea of. It was sort of a Reddit for AI agents where the AI agents get on this platform and talk about their human owners. So that's the sort of sci-fi Brave New World we're headed to, I believe, or we're in, perhaps.
I'm curious the name of that company, or I guess I'll Google it later. But if anyone has a link, please drop it. Um, yeah, Santiago, I guess just my question is kind of maybe too big, but if you can start to answer it, or maybe we could follow up later. But yeah, I guess I was super interested in Kalia's comment about like norms and how people engage with standards bodies like yours. Like, how do the meetings run? If you could give us a glimpse into like what actually doing this work looks like. Zoom in real life, are these like civil society organizations paid, the companies paying? Like how does it actually get done?
So I guess there are two different aspects to it. There's the work that's being done by the C2PA around the actual standard itself. And so they meet on a regular schedule. There is an expectation. There are different levels of membership of the C2PA, and some money does have to change hands because of the Linux Foundation's protocols and all of that. But those are regular, detailed technical meetings divided up into task forces to discuss, whatever the issue is. So that's really where the sausage is getting made, right? And everything is being validated and verified by experts across those organizations, people with, significant experience in the various areas. That's what makes the standard so robust is all of those experts coming in and making this open source standard. And the work that we're doing around accelerating implementation of the standard, as I mentioned, has sort of three different aspects. The GitHub, facilitation tools, all of that. The productization where everybody's out there productizing this as appropriate in their line of products. And then the awareness. So, for example, last year in New York, we did a content authenticity summit at the Cornell Tech campus on Roosevelt Island, where we had a couple of hundred experts on provenance from around the world. That community, certainly in the United States and Western Europe, is mature enough and is well versed enough in the material so that we could have really robust breakout sessions with subject matter experts from the various areas to answer in real time questions, whether philosophical or practical, by implementers. I'm in the process of organizing another big event in May of this year in Singapore with the online safety folks from the Singaporean government think tank there. It's a sort of a beachhead, I suppose, that we're putting out in South Asia. That community is probably a little bit less well versed than who we had in New York, so we're calibrating that event to sort of make sure everybody understands what we're talking about and take it from there. There's an event being planned, I believe, in Japan later this year with the BBC and NHK around broadcast uses specifically. There's a lot of different events going on. The IBC, the International Broadcasting Gathering, every year in Europe, has been doing accelerator courses in conjunction with the European Broadcasting Union. There's all sorts of events and more, and from what we can tell, more and more interest in this as people begin to wake up and begin to realize that, hey, this is something that really we should be interested in and concerned about. We're starting to see a groundswell of interest in implementation. The CTPA's conformance work is going gangbusters as people seek to get their implementations, get that stamp of approval from the C2PA. So it takes many different forms, but it's all moving together. And then, some in real life gatherings like the one in New York, like the one in Singapore coming up, and others online. So yeah, it's a vibrant community.
Super cool to hear about. Thank you so much. And thanks for coming. And Renad, I know you joined late, but I'm glad you got to jump in here. It's nice to see you. Um, yeah, so let's unmute and give our presenter a big round of applause. Thank you so much, Santiago.
Thank
Everyone.
you. Thank you for the opportunity. If anybody wants to follow up, you can probably get my email through Val, or the best way to get a hold of me, honestly, is DM me on LinkedIn. It cuts through all the email noise. And if you want to have a follow-on conversation, we can try and get something on the calendar. And yeah, spread the word, get involved, join the CAI. It's free. And it's a good community. So thank you, everybody, for your time today. And it's a pleasure to present.
Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day, everyone. See you next week.